So I have been asked several times in my comments to compare the Sony a6400 to the new Canon R10. Now on paper, these are pretty similar cameras when it comes to specs, but the question is, are they really similar? Yeah, they are. So this is great. I love these videos. These actually helped build my channel in the early stages, and they are not video comparisons. You're not going to see side-by-side footage. There's lots of footage on the channel if you want to go check out side-by-side comparisons, but these videos people find very helpful, at least that's what they tell me, because they can see in black and white the differences between the two cameras, because some of those differences are deal breakers depending on who you are. Got my trusty GH5 over here and my trusty little Panasonic G7, my little 2-camera setup that I love very much. I don't care that these cameras came out in 1965. They still work and I'm still gonna use them. So the Canon R10 and the Sony a6400 do have a lot in common. They are among the entry-level price points for each of the brands in terms of hybrid cameras. They both have 24 megapixel sensors. They both have 2.36 million dot electronic viewfinders. They both take great photos and great video. The video has no record limit. They can both do 120 frames per second in HD. They can both shoot all the way up to 4K 30. The Canon can do a little more, but you can get great 4K. Both are oversampled from 6K. The image from the a6400 and the R10 are both downsampled from 6K, which is why the image looks so sharp. And they share some bad stuff too. There is bad rolling shutter on both cameras in 4K. There is no headphone port on either camera. They have one card slot, so there is no backup recording, and they both have some finicky problems when you want to do external monitoring. So let's start with the new kid on the block, the Canon R10. What are the advantages the Canon R10 has over the Sony a6400? Well, number one, the LCD screen is much better. It has a higher resolution, but it also looks much better. It also is a touchscreen, and that touchscreen works very well, and it has great menus with that touchscreen. So none of that is good on the a6400. The a6400 has the old Sony menus. You can't use the touch function to go through the menus, and the screen looks very bad, the LCD screen, so you'll find yourself using that EVF a lot on the Sony. The Canon has 15 frames per second in terms of mechanical shutter compared to 11 frames per second. It does do 23 electronic shutter, but I do not think that that is a benefit for the Canon because it does suffer from the rolling shutter, so you will find that you will not use the electronic shutter much, but that 15 frames per second compared to 11, that's a big bump. That is some good burst rate for the Canon. And a big headline feature is 10-bit in HDR. It has 422 10-bit in one mode, and that is HDR. So if you do shoot in that mode, you'll have to convert it to Rec 709 if you want to play it normally, or you can output it to HDR if you want. Now it does feature 4K 60. This 4K 60 is a big crop though. It is a 1.6 times crop, and it's already a crop sensor camera that is 1.6 times. So it really punches in there. So you have to think about that when you have a lens, because it's going to be hard to get a wide shot of 4K 60 on the R10. And the 4K 60 is a little soft in all the tests. I used it for about a month recently, and the 4K 60 is a little soft, but it's still great to have 4K 60 compared to nothing that the a6400 has. But what I'm saying is I wouldn't buy the R10 for the 4K 60 alone. But speaking of crops, there are no crops in 4K on the Canon R10. Other than the 4K 60, the 30, the 25, the 24, there is no crop. On the a6400, when you go into 30, 4K 30, you will get a 1.23 times crop. There's no crop in 24 or 25, but in 4K 30 for the a6400, there is a noticeable crop. The R10 has electronic stabilization. Neither camera actually has IBIS, in-body image stabilization, but the Canon does do an electronic stabilization like they did with their M50, and it actually works pretty well. They have a normal version digital IS and then enhanced digital IS. The enhanced crops in too much for my liking and doesn't seem to add much, but the regular digital image stabilization is actually pretty good. You can vlog, handheld with the R10. You cannot do that with the a6400. If you want to move around with the a6400 in video, you are going to need a gimbal for sure. The Canon R10 has eye detect in video in all modes, including 120 frames per second, where the a6400, it has face detect, but it doesn't have eye. Now, to be fair to the a6400, the autofocus is fantastic, and I don't think you're going to notice the difference between the two in terms of autofocus just because of the eye detect. The a6400 has excellent autofocus, but still, the R10 has eye detect. And you also keep face and eye detect when you connect to an external monitor. Now the R10, so the screen does go black, and I will talk about that when I'm talking about the positives for the a6400. Your screen goes black, so you can't use your menus in the R10 when you're hooked up to an external monitor, but you do keep your good face and eye detect autofocus, which is great. Now you can output the entire signal to your external recorder so that you can see your menus on the screen, but then you can only use the external recorder. So you can't do dual recording. So with the a6400, you lose face and eye detect when you are recording connected to an external monitor in video. You still have autofocus, but it is a center focus, so if something waves in front of you, then it will focus on that instead of keeping on your face and eye, which is too bad. Now, once again, there is a workaround with the a6400, which is that if you output to HDMI only, you will keep your face and eye detect autofocus. As Gerald Undone uncovered with the A7 III, it's the same thing. You can keep face and eye detect autofocus through an external recorder if you change your menu settings to be output over HDMI only. The R10 has the flip out screen, so for most people that is a major benefit. You're vlogging, you're doing your whatever, or you put up an external monitor or a microphone on the hot shoe, you're gonna want it to flip to the side so that you can see yourself. And not just that, a lot of people, photos, you know, they wanna have the screen to be able to tilt 360 degrees however they want it. Most people prefer the flip out screen as opposed to the flip up screen of the a6400. The ergonomics and grip, I think, are better on the R10. It's a more comfortable camera to hold, but that is a little bit of personal preference. But I think generally the Canon cameras feel better to hold than the Sony cameras, at least in the APS-C world. And lastly, the R10 has the USB-C port compared to the archaic micro USB port on the a6400. Now guys, it is not all bad for the a6400. It does have some advantages over the R10. Let's start with weather sealing. The a6400 is a weather sealed camera. The Canon R10 is not. So you want to go out in the rain, then you can't take your R10, but you can take the a6400. It is better in low light. I have tested all of the Sony APS-C cameras and all of the Canon APS-C cameras, and the Sony APS-C, they just do better in low light than the Canon R10. Go through my channel if you want to see tons of comparisons, but the bottom line is if you're going to be shooting a lot in really low light conditions, which you shouldn't do, bring a light, for God's sake, but if you are shooting in low light conditions, the a6400 is going to do you better. A6400 has a much better white balance implementation. The R10, if you're in video, you have to switch it into a photo mode, take a picture of your white balance, and then set that to the custom white balance. And the Sony menu, you can just set it to your custom white balance in video with one click, which is much, much better. I set my white balance constantly when I'm going around because I am a super professional, so I really get frustrated with the R10 trying to white balance in photo and then going back to video. It's a pain in the butt. Speaking of pains in the butt, the histogram, it disappears on the R10. The histogram, when you start recording your video, so to judge your exposure, then the a6400, the histogram stays as you press record. For some reason with Canon, it just disappears. So if your light changes, you don't see your histogram changing because it is not there. And so you may want to use zebras with the R10, but there is now another problem with that, and that the zebras don't work well on the 10-bit HDR mode, which is the mode that, of course, most people would want to use because it's 10-bit. If you're not using 10-bit, you can still use the zebras just fine on the R10, but once you go past 75 on the R10 with zebras, then they won't work anymore. They won't show you where your highlights will be clipped at 100 or 85, which is too bad, whereas the zebras work great on the a6400. Even if you're using HLG3, whatever you're using, zebras stay solid. keep going with the zebras. There are zebras in photos. That is how I like to take photos, because I like to put the zebras at 100% when I'm taking a photo, and then to keep my sky, I wait till I see the zebras on the sky, then I dial it back. That way I can get as much shadow detail and keep my sky as much as I want, whereas with the Canon, I don't get zebras in photos, so I have to just judge by the histogram. Now, that is what a lot of people do anyway, but for me, that is a big con, so I'm going to write that in. So now, while you lose face and eye detect when you connect to an external monitor with the a6400, you at least get the option to record simultaneously to a recorder like the Ninja 5 that I'm looking at right now, and also to the card. Now, you are going to still have the autofocus, like I said in the last segment, but it is not going to be face and eye, so if stuff waves in front, then that is too bad, but at least you get the recording, and as I said previously, you can then switch it to do HDMI only if you want to keep the face and eye detect. But at least you have the option of redundant recording with this system here, whereas with the Canon, you do not. There are better slow motion options on the a6400. They both do 120 frames per second in slow motion, but the Canon, it just makes the file for you with no sound and it outputs it at 30p. I shoot in 24, so then on my timeline, I have to make an adjustment, and then I don't get to speed ramp. I don't get to speed it up and slow it down and do the things I want to do, because it just gives me a fully formed slow motion clip with no sound. Now, the a6400 can do that. If you use the S&Q mode, the slow and quick mode, it will do the same thing, but the a6400 has the added bonus of just being able to record in 120 frames per second. So you'll still hear your audio, everything will be fine. You can speed it up, slow it down, do whatever you want. Far more flexible in terms of its slow motion capabilities. In terms of price, the a6400 is about $100 cheaper if you just buy it body only right now, and I would encourage you to look for a used a6400, because there are a lot around. You're not going to find any used R10s. It's hard to buy one new, for God's sake, but a6400 you can definitely find used, so you might find a pretty good deal with that. And speaking of deals, one of the best deals about entering the Sony system is the lens selection. The Canon R10 currently doesn't have very many lenses. In fact, for APS-C, it only has 2, and those are kit lenses. So for the Canon R10, you are going to have to buy the Canon adapter and adapt EF glass if you want to get a lot of options for lenses. You can use the RF lenses as well. A lot of them are big and heavy and expensive lenses for the Canon cameras, for their full frame cameras, and you can use those on the R10 as well. However, you just simply can't find as many native mount lenses for the Canon R10. So if you're new out there and you're not in either system, it's not as easy for the Canon as going out, grabbing some lenses at low prices with low apertures that don't require an adapter, because that does not exist. Now with Sony, you get your Viltrox, your TT Artisans, your Sigmas, your Tamrons, you just a plethora of lenses that are available that, like right now I'm using the Sigma 16mm f1.4 on my GH5. That is also available on the Sony, and I use it all the time on my little ZV-E10. So in terms of price, especially if you want to buy used and then you want to get some fast glass, some 1.4s from Viltrox and Sigmas and some of those wide angle lenses like Sony's been putting out lately, boy, there's a lot of good lenses for the a6400, and the Canon R10, it's going to be more difficult to find the lenses. So all I'm saying is do your research. If you want to get into the Canon system, do your research about which lenses that you think you're going to need for the way you shoot, and make sure that you can find them. You definitely can find them on the Sony, but check out with the Canon what adapter you need, what glass you need, and take it from there. So obviously these are both great cameras, and I think you could be happy with either one. I certainly would be happy with either camera. They're both fantastic. But in terms of the a6400, that is over 3 years old at this point, and it is due for a refresh, I would think, fairly soon. Sony probably should be refreshing their APS-C line, if they're ever going to do it, pretty soon. The R10 was just refreshed, so you know, refreshed, it was just invented. You know that is a brand new camera, so you can feel good about purchasing that in terms of it won't be replaced quickly. However, you're going to have to do the waiting game for a lot of the appropriate lenses, at least for the near future. What is it? It is September 20th, 2022 when I am recording this, and Canon is going to have to play catch up really quickly to get a bunch of R-mount APS-C lenses. So with the Sony, given what I just said, I would look for a used a6400 if that is the camera that you are settled on. If you definitely want an a6400 for video, almost exclusively video, I would encourage you strongly to get the ZV-E10. The ZV-E10 is cheaper and it is a better camera for video when, and in my most popular video on the whole channel is comparing the a6400 to the ZV-E10 in a spec video, just like this one right here. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? I'll do more of these videos if you guys keep watching. Anyway, thanks for watching this one. We'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.